Welcome to another edition of Throwing Down Heavy Light. My name is Jamal Binding. I'm the chair of the board of MORE, Movement Omaha for Race Equity. Today we have Mike Poulin, who has worked for the Sisters of Mercies of the Americas since 2014. He currently serves as Adjusted Resource Manager in the Omaha Regional Office, where he works to facilitate Mercy community involvement in action and advocacy around 5 critical areas: nonviolence, racism, earth, women, immigration, and previously Mike worked in the Ministry of Catholic Parishes in Omaha and Kansas City and Washington, D.C. Mike's wife, Cheryl, has been a pastoral care coordinator with the Sisters of Mercy in Omaha since May of 2023. Cheryl and their adult son, Isaac, put on Mike as he explores practical ways to live out Catholic social teachings. He enjoys reading, biking, kayaking, flying kites, and the mountains in his free times. Mike, welcome to Throwing Down Some Heavy Light. Oh, before that, I want to say one other thing is I mentioned it later on, but I met you initially way back at Catholic Charity, so we kind of know each other from way back. There's kind of a disclaimer there. So first, share anything else you want to share about yourself with the viewing audience.
Well, thanks, Ajmal. It's good to be here with you today. I guess the only other things I, kind of thought about that might be of interest is I grew up as an Air Force brat. My dad was in the Air Force. Omaha has mostly been my home through my youth and my adult life, but not completely. A lot of my connections and work experience is in the Catholic community, but I'm always wanting to learn more about all kinds of different things. So some of the topics we'll talk about today are part of that.
Good, good. Now, I recently watched your issue with Nellie Did Said, who lives in Honduras. She's also a Mercy Associate, and she practices human rights and nonviolence. From your perspective in that Zoom interview, and it just happened recently, why did Mercy bring Mrs. Nellie to the United States on the speaking tour? And I also noticed she only spoke in Spanish, so was that problematic for you?
Okay. So, we'll talk about some of this later, I'm sure. Just as I think, we as white people aren't very good at listening to voices of people of color, I think we as Americans aren't very good at listening to voices from outside our country, especially when those voices hold up a mirror to our actions, the actions of our government, the actions of our society. So we hosted Nellie, because she brings an alternative voice from a Honduran perspective to our conversations about U.S. policy. Her thoughts encompass politics, militarism, economics. So also the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas, the organization I work for, includes a number of countries in Central and South America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. So we have sisters and associates in these places, some of whom, were born there. That's where they're from. And so their perspective is important to us. So, we do what we can to then, share those voices, within the Mercy community and sometimes outside of the Mercy community. I was traveling with Nellie before we did the webinar on Saturday. She did some speaking engagements that I was at in San Francisco and in Chicago. And then I sent her on and she went on to Philadelphia and Rhode Island. And today she's in Washington, D.C. The Spanish adds an extra step to what we have to do to provide interpretation for presentations. But because we have a lot of sisters in the community who are native Spanish speakers, a lot of the presentations and resources that we put out are often in 2 languages, sometimes 3. We also sometimes cover one other language. So we do that to assure that all of the members of the Mercy community can participate in our work.
Okay, good, good. Given your experience with racial justice and educational issues, could you elaborate on your unique challenges as a white male in this community and faith-focused organizations or the church? Talk a little bit more about that with us.
So kind of my experience really started, I've done social justice work for a while. I think of myself as kind of late to the game to really focusing on racism. I think when we first met, I kind of got connected, with Table Talk and some things going on at the Archdiocese, but I was only in that position for about a year. And so I didn't really continue with that. So when I came to work for Mercy, one of the things that my boss initially said to me after my first year is, I need you to get more educated around the issue of racism. So there was really support for me to do that. So I started doing some reading. I started going to events locally. I went to a national conference called the White Privilege Conference that I think has been a kind of an annual thing to kind of figure out some of the stuff that I didn't know because it wasn't an area that I had worked in a lot. And so as I started to learn more, I realized that just learning wasn't enough, and started then trying to figure out what do I do about racism as a white person in America. And so initially, I was on for a while was on an anti-racism committee that we had internally in Mercy. And then in places that I taught and started presenting, I started trying to share what I was learning around racism as a white person. And not to be like when I talk about racial issues in those forums, I try to make it very clear that one, I have never experienced racism, so I'm not talking from personal experience about racism being directed towards me, and I'm not an expert, so I really try to share things about what my journey about learning about racism is, and then encourage people that they need to be on that journey too if they're not. Particularly white audiences. So I feel like I'm still on that journey, and I feel like I have to try to find a balance between talking about what I've learned, but also then bringing in voices of people of color, whether that's through media or in person. And then I think, when I talk about in places that I've talked about racial justice, they have tended to, I have to admit, they've tended to be like pretty safe spaces. They're college campuses, parish events, office programs and meetings. And I don't get a lot of pushback really or negative responses in those areas. Sometimes I do on social media, but I tend to think that that's more about less about me being a white person talking about racism than it is about people being defensive for being called out for racist posts.
Mhm.
And then, in the faith spaces that I have been in, like they're places that I'm pretty comfortable. I think when I tend to do things that are more out there, well, they tend to be with like we did the white people panel at First United Methodist Church that time. That was a bit outside of my comfort zone. I not only got to be a white person on that panel, I was the only male on that panel. But it was a good experience, I think, not just for me, but I think for people to hear that kind of thing. It was quite a bit different than what we're used to hearing about racism, those of us who delve into that. So I think the biggest challenge for me is I to balance the fact that I feel like I need to talk about this as a white person, but I'm not an expert on racism in any sense of the word, but I do have places that I can talk about it. And I feel like I have to continue to figure out ways to do that.
Mike, as you mentioned, the First United Methodist Church, what was interesting about the onset of that is that the title of it was Aljamal's Seven White Friends. And so I asked each one of your predetermined question about race and how you've been challenged by me or in general. But we also had I think, a wonderful table talk afterwards where people at the table talked about those issues of how do you develop relationships and friendship with people of different races, nationality. But it was a good segue. We had a good turnout that day. And I remember it came out very positive in terms of the interviews and so on. But people did find it funny that I only had 7 white friends that day. So I want to switch up and ask you a little bit different. One of the challenges we face, Mike, in getting people to do with more is more public policy work, work with elected officials and administrators in our state and local government on anti-racism issue. Are there challenges that you face are embracing your work from a public policy point of view?
Yeah, so a lot of the public policy work that we do in Mercy is on the federal level. And what we find is, I think the average person doesn't have a sense or get really involved in policy or talking to elected officials. So I think one of the challenges is, initially is to get people interested, find out what issues they're interested in working on, and then at least in the beginning, to give them ways to do that that are really easy.
Mhm.
So we do a lot of email alerts to our constituents around, hey, there's this legislation coming up. We want you to email or call your senator or your representative about that. We give them background information. We even sometimes formulate a message. That's really the real basics of, getting people to communicate. It's not the most effective way to get changes made, but it can be an effective way to get people connected. And so some of the things we've started doing more recently is, educating people on, how do letters to the editor work, how do lobby visits work. And then our next step is going to be to, invite more people around particular issues to do that. I think for us on the national level, the federal legislation, we have a staff of 10. So we're all following different issues, and so we can kind of focus on certain things. The challenge that I find being somebody kind of out in the field, because our main office is in the Washington, D.C. area, is, I'm responsible for quite a number of states, and following state issues is more challenging because they tend to come up quickly and go away quickly. Like our legislative session in Nebraska was, just 4 months long. And so I sometimes depend then on local organizations that are doing the state advocacy, to communicate about what's happening. So then I can kind of rally the folks that I know to say, hey, we need to be saying something about this. When it comes to racial issues, I think um, there's my experience has been that there's not often a whole lot of legislation around things. So then it's like if we're getting policies done, it can be policies on the very local level, which I think really takes relationships, whether that's with the mayor's office or city council or businesses. And relationships take a lot of time to build and to maintain. And so I think even sometimes the more local stuff gets, it can be more time consuming to have your voice heard on things because they tend to be kind of more smaller issues. I don't want to say small as not important, but they're kind of more narrowly defined issues. And keeping up on what's happening and figuring out how to influence them can be time consuming and challenging.
As you mentioned that, I know you talked a great deal about your federal thing, but I recall Sister Carolyn Coffey was a dear friend. She's late now, but she had to fight with the Mercies. They were advocating for Keystone housing in that area with low income housing, and her sharing with me was she was surprised at the level of racism and negativity in trying to put low income housing in that area of town and what she went through and what she learned about local racism. But again, part of that, I also talked to Kathy Jeffries, who was a former board member, and she's late also, but her comment was a little bit different. She says they were just bothered by OHA and some of these entities when they put things in, they do a bait and switch. They may promise a high level of quality of housing, then when they come out, they don't have it on a certain level. So there was different concepts that I learned from white folks about how they dealt with racism, particularly with public housing in our local Omaha community. I want to ask you a different point. I know you teach at the College of St. Mary's. My question is, what is it like teaching at the College of St. Mary's, which is a white women institution and predominantly, and you're a white male? What is that like teaching there? And also, I know you teach something related to race or justice in some of your classes. What's that like for you?
So because of my connection to the Sisters of Mercy, a few years ago, they came over and offered, yeah, and had a last minute opening for a theology class. And so I had 2 weeks to prepare to teach a class called Spirituality and Peace Building. So I've been doing that on and off for a number of years. I don't teach every semester. And so working for the Sisters of Mercy, it's predominantly a women's organization. There's probably, I think, 30 people who work in our office here, and I think there's maybe 5 or 6 men. So I've gotten used to working, around women, around sisters. I think being on campus over there, that my job experience has made that a bit more comfortable. But it is always interesting. Like I'm always the only man in the room when I'm teaching, unless I brought in a guest speaker like yourself. Um, and it's another area that I kind of have to be conscious of, just like when I'm talking about race as a white person, I think I have to be conscious in talking pretty much about anything in an audience of all women. And I try to bring in some other women's voices. I'm grateful that in the theology department, which is the department I teach in, the two full-time professors are both women, and I think most of the other adjuncts are women. They're getting the students who take theology courses are not getting, lots and lots of men talking at them. But we do try to have conversations. I try to listen to the ideas that students have around that. I also think the college, as far as, kind of diversifying their student base, I would say, most semesters my students have it's probably been about a 3-to-1 split, students of white and students of color. And they've done some outreach to try and do some things about that. And I think some years they're more successful than others. When I talk, and so as a focus on peace building is kind of one of the topics of my class. I started looking a few years ago at, what are some real obstacles to peace in our world right now. And the two topics that really, as I started to reflect on it, that really came to the top for me at the time were things around climate and the earth and issues around race. So I do modules on both of those with my students, just as just because I think if we're not looking at how we're addressing racism, we're, excluding the whole idea of a peaceful society. We're excluding a lot of people from that. And so I find as students, as we've gotten further along in the time that I've been there, students are more likely to have had some education on racism. I think initially when I did that, I would have a lot of students who would say, "Oh, I've never had anything. We've never talked about racism in any class I've ever been in anywhere."
Wow.
I think it's maybe becoming a little bit more prevalent depending on where they grew up and what kind of schools they went to. But I also think students are interested in it. And I don't know if that's everywhere, but that's what I have found at the College of St. Mary is students are interested in that topic.
Interesting to share that we had a contact from someone in Council Bluffs public schools asked us about some racism, and they're talking at the elementary level. And then the other thing, we've been very supported by the Mercy High School, have supported more. So we're kind of impressed with that taking place and dealing with the topic of racism and anti-racism, at least challenging and deconstructing that so it's not the taboo topic that the white supremacists like to do in Nebraska and some places don't want to even have a conversation. Again, you don't grow. The other thing is your son attended a Catholic high school, I think it was Scott, and you helped facilitate an invitation for me to speak at that school. I guess my question is if you could offer suggestions for ministers at Catholic schools or predominantly white institutions for diversifying not only their staff, their student, and what suggestions would you offer to them to help deal with that collective body? And again, knowing your experience with your son at that school and even your experiences and work with other predominantly private or Catholic institutions in our community.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much different my thoughts would be for Catholic institutions or other institutions. I mean, I think in some ways, my first thought around this is I think we need to value the idea of diversity more than we do. I think there's in some circles, there's efforts to hire somebody to do diversity, equity, and inclusion in an organization. I think that's a good thing. But I think it can also, if that's the only thing that an organization does to say, oh, we have this person now who does that, I think diversity is more than that. I also, I can't tell you how many times in the recent past I've been talking to somebody at institutions that I won't name, who they've said, "Oh yeah, we interviewed somebody. We interviewed somebody who was Latino. We interviewed somebody who was Black, and they were just almost as good as the other candidate that we hired, but not just that we just decided the other candidate was a little better." And there's a part of me, I look at that and it's like, okay, well, it's great that you interviewed, a diverse candidate pool, but if we really were valuing diversity, that would be a component of what we're looking for when we're hiring people. And so I think that sometimes means that our traditional or kind of stereotypical what is the best candidate needs to change. And I think if there's a lot of us white folks doing all the hiring, it's hard for us to acknowledge that sometimes, and it's hard for us to see that. But if we don't get a diversity of voices, not just in our student bodies or in our, entry level positions, if it's not our professors and our administration, people who are making decisions, things aren't going to change.
Mhm.
And I don't know right now, personally, I don't know what it's like hiring at a school or on a campus. I know everybody's strapped for money. I know everybody's losing teachers, whether you're a public school or a Catholic school, teachers are getting out of the business. I can't imagine what that's like right now. I don't know, I have no idea what kind of applicants that they're getting. But I do wonder, how much more we can change kind of what we're valuing when we interview candidates, and that a diversity of viewpoints should be a pretty high value, particularly, when we're talking about, Catholic institutions that are wanting to be open to everybody.
As you mentioned, that it came to mind that sometimes you look at these institutions, they're a hire person who's a token, and they deal with the issue of qualification. But if you look at their output, or what did they do significantly for the year? And I'm not going to name names like the local government. They hire these so-called experts, DEI, and when you ask them for data or what changed or how many people of color, whoever work in institution, have they changed their strategic plan, and it's business as usual. So it's almost ironic that, they will go out and give the lip service or make a statement, but at the end of the day, in our diverse community, pretty much integrated in Omaha in terms of our population numbers, you don't see them in certain places and represented in all these kind of DEI implementation stages. Like even board of directors, management, all that doesn't reflect the population of our city. So again, diversity is a complex topic for some people, but it could be a lot more simple if they would bring the people, engage them directly in what they're talking about.
Mhm.
So, about a year ago, I participated in a tri-faith race conference. They're going to have one coming up here in June. And I was surprised at the lack of theological experts in our community at this conference from both the local colleges. I know you and Old Creighton and some other places have people we call theologians. Um, and they were not engaged at the level I thought they would be in terms of these scholars and so on. Basically, my question is: have you interacted with local theologians in the city? And maybe you might want to talk about. We sometimes talk about what's the difference between a theologian and a minister, or whatever. But help us with: have you interacted with theologians? The fact that you work in a predominantly Catholic institution.
Yeah, so I didn't look up what the textbook definition of theologian is, but my thoughts around it is somebody with an advanced theology degree.
Okay.
And so when I think about that from a Catholic perspective, most of the time I'm going to find theologians, on a college campus. You'll find all pastors of Catholic churches in the area are going to have theology degrees. Some of them will have done advanced studies and other things. Um, so, so I don't know that necessarily, pastors would consider them in the Catholic tradition. Most pastors, I don't know that they would consider themselves theologians because they're focused more on ministry to
Mhm.
the people than they are in kind of thinking about, as not that they don't think about, theological questions, but they're not pushing forward different ideas and things like that. So, so I have access to folks who are theologians. I would consider my supervisor at the College of St. Mary a theologian. I have a friend at Creighton University who I consider a theologian. I know a number of people who work at some of our high schools who have some advanced theology degrees. So they're people I converse with. Um, you know, I always kind of wondered when we look at kind of the college component, is when I have invited people to come off of the college campus to do things, they have agreed. I'm not sure how much they look for that though. And so that would be one thing that I would say. The other is, I think we as Catholics are not very good on the whole at doing things that are ecumenical.
Mm.
So with other faith traditions, I think there are times that we do that, but I don't know too many Catholic folks who are connected at Tri-Faith. So it wouldn't surprise me. Two things wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me that there weren't any Catholics to step up and say, "Oh, hey, we want to come to your conference." And it wouldn't surprise me that there might not be very many relationships between tri-faith and the Catholic community for them to say, "Oh, hey, we know this person. We want to invite them to come." My sense would be if there was invitations that I know some folks who would be interested in doing that, but I
Mhm.
can't speak for them. I did work. I did work with one of the Jesuits over at Creighton a number of years ago. He came to the College of St. Mary's and did a hybrid online in-person presentation on a book that he's written around racism. So he was really interested in doing that. He was also had another book coming out, so he was kind of promoting that too. So I think in some cases there needs to be more conversation. I think we as Catholics could do a much better job at being connected with other faith traditions and being more interactive that way. But I think, there's so many Catholics in Omaha. Like when I moved here, the number was like 40% of Omaha was Catholic.
Right, right.
I don't know if that's still the number. I bet it's a little bit lower now. But we can be busy just being Catholics. And so I think a lot of people do that because it's a comfortable place. But I think there could be other things that could be really fruitful as well.
Mhm. I find that perplexing question that theologian and minister or priest or clergy in a sense. And I was talking to Dr. Cynthia Littlemeyer about this one day, and her comment was a minister can be a theologian, but a theologian can't be a minister. And the way she translated it was like a practitioner. In other words, a minister goes out and does all this kind of work, and it can also be scholarly. But
Mhm.
theologians are almost purely scholarly, and they work primarily at university levels. So she was using an example of Malcolm X, where Malcolm X didn't have his formal teaching credentials or whatever, but Malcolm was so brilliant and bright and like a genius that he can operate with all kind of PhD folks anywhere because he was that much well read. And so it was interesting to hear that she says it's praxis. How do you demonstrate that work? And so again, when you have somebody who's in need or need counseling, ministers and do all that kind of work, that kind of like lay people and interact with all kinds of folks. Because theologians are she defined them as primarily scholars in a sense. So she said her PhD was in ministry, but she also knows a lot about different faith groups. And I do know it comes to mind years ago, I was talking to Rabbi Israel about table talk. And he says, Oh, Jamar, I'd love to have you do a table talk with all the clergy because we don't get together from these different denominations. Say, well, it never happened, but he really wanted to see that happen at one point where we had some kind of a annual clergy table talk where people got together, at least learned about other faiths. Not that we're going to convert and change people, but just to be sensitive to some of those minority religions and faith communities that we don't otherwise deal with. So that was another issue. One of the things that we reset, as I alluded to earlier, we had this council of elementary school talk about racism. And, my question to you as a parent of a white child, did racism, classism, poverty issues come up in your teaching your child about social justice? Again, this is you and your wife, Cheryl, dealing with that. But how do you deal with that as an age appropriate teaching as a parent to your kid? And you went through a lot of that in your circles that you interact. But talk to me about teaching those social justice issues, poverty, racism, so on. How do you do that when you're dealing with children? That's one of our students, young students.
Yeah, I think if you can write a children's book about it, you can talk about it with kids, right? So, there's all this fear right now about, oh, we can't have these books in schools, we can't have those books in schools. I find it a little bit perplexing and short-sighted. When Isaac was growing up, we did a number of things as a family that kind of put him in, I think, some different spaces. So when we lived in Washington, D.C., we volunteered with an organization that provided housing to homeless immigrant and refugee families. So we had single immigrant mothers living in our house. He got to go to actually a Catholic grade school that had 500 kids, 40 nationalities.
Oh, wow.
So a very diverse initial grade school experience where, I would show up at a soccer game and somebody asked me which kid was mine. And I would say, oh, the blonde one over there, because he was the only blonde kid, so that was a good experience for him. I mean, I think growing up around the immigrant community, we would talk about some of the issues were for immigrants coming to this country and why we were trying to help. And then when we moved back to Omaha, we were family teachers on the Boys Town campus for a while. And so he got to live in that setting. There was some good and bad with that. But it put him in a place where he got to see, kids who needed some help, and were looking for a safe place. And, what does that mean and why do we help? I kind of look back, I'm not sure how often we had conversations, particularly about race, probably more about poverty and class. And I kind of look back, I kind of regret that out of my ignorance around some of that I didn't talk more directly about that because I know probably you with your kids had to talk about racism and how
Right.
you deal with different situations. And I had the privilege of not having to do that because, it wasn't something that was going to affect him in a very direct way, but it affects the community that he's in. So we've had talked some about it now, and sometimes I share some articles or some things that I've read or some things that I'm doing. He's a grown adult now, so we're a long way for that. But I do kind of think there are some things looking back that, oh, I wish I had done this a little differently, or I had talked more about these things because it wasn't something that came to mind at the time.
Mhm. Mike, as you mentioned, some of these things as you share this, it jumps into my mind or it comes up an incident. I'm reminded of my son when he graduated from college. One of the first cars that he bought was a used Mercedes SUV, and he let his high school brother drive it. And we was in the Irvington area, and a police officer pulled him over because he didn't expect somebody that young to be driving a Mercedes. He thought he'd stole it, but I had
Right.
to talk to my kids about when you get the Douglas County Sheriff Department, Omaha Police Department with their lack of diversity and race issues, that's going to happen. And then when I did table talk, I heard all kinds of stories from parents and friends and people who had similar experiences. And I remember one white parent said she was driving down the street, she saw a police officer pulled over a black person, and she stopped just to watch to make sure it wouldn't turn into a terrible incident. But it was a positive, warm feeling when she shared that at a table talk that as a result of doing table talks over the years, she felt a sense of being an ally and a comrade because she knew how the Omaha Police Department was with their no complaints or, again, things like that. So it's interesting and important when we share stories and experiences that can help us make us a better community.
Yeah, kind of to follow up on that a little bit, I do remember it was probably Isaac was probably in high school. He and I were both big Star Trek fans. And LeVar Burton came to Omaha. He's from Star Trek and actor and the Reading Rainbow.
Right,
People knew
right,
him
very
before
cool.
that. He does a really good podcast right now. But here we are. We were at the auditorium at the Joslin to hear him speak. And it was probably a 90% white audience. And he tells a story about being pulled over by the police. And he kind of, physically acted out what he did, how he rolled down his window and before the police officer walked up, he put both hands out the window on the side of the car so that they could see his hand. And I'm like, everybody's watching him, and I'm like looking around to see how are people reacting to this? Because this was a thing I was clued into at this point in time, people getting pulled over because of
Right,
the color of their skin. And we did have a conversation about that with the family afterwards. It was just like, okay, he wasn't being funny. Like this was a real thing.
right,
And I just wonder how shocked some people in the audience were, to hear Geordie LaForge talking about getting pulled over and having to put his hands outside the car or feeling
right,
like that's the only way he could be safe. Uh,
right.
but it was very dramatic, and I think it was probably eye-opening for a lot of folks.
Each one of these stories, memories come back to you, especially when you get older. But LaRon Henderson, who worked for a youth organization years back, used to drive to Lincoln because their main institution was in Lincoln, so he'd have to commute back and forth driving. And one day he told me a story that I had to bust out laughing. He said he was driving Lincoln, and the Nebraska State Patrol pulled him over. And he was, following the law and everything. So he asked this white officer, "Why did you pull me over?" And the white officer answered to him basically, "Because I can." And he didn't sign him with a ticket or nothing, but LeRon came back and told me that story. And I said, this is why you need the Nebraska State Patrol to have more integration and training, because again, that can traumatize people. But the fact he told me that story, and again, I like to name names and drop institutions, they need to clean their act up. But I know they haven't done much since then. So, police officers and law enforcement need to clean it up. And do know one of the guys who used to work at the Douglas County office, Wayne told me the story that when they do training online, a lot of the officers would turn the volume all the way down, just sit through their, because this is during COVID and elsewhere where they wouldn't even listen to stuff. They just start working on other projects. So when he is in a key position, told me that's how they operate, then we wonder how these institutions, these patrol guys and, people who work in the sheriff's office, why they act the way they do towards many people of color and do racist things. So it's things we got to continue to push back at our law enforcement, particularly if they're making money off the public role as employees from the public. So that, I've been asking this question, Mike. I've been asking my white friends associates how they avoid being bystanders or how do they address race issues. In short, if they can name 3 times in the past year they've advocated for someone who's racially different from them. My question, somebody, is what are other indicators that you would have similar questions to measure one's commitments to social justice? And by the way, Mike, I do that to measure who can be on my board of directors of white friends. If they can't answer, then I have to kick them to the curb and put them on the bench or put them on sabbatical until they come up with some answers. But my question is, how would you measure that or deal with that question?
I think this is the hardest question you asked me, Jamal. I mean, I think the advocating question is really good. It made me think, about, okay, well, what positions am I in where I have been able to do that, and have I or haven't I? Um, I think, um, I think finding ways to speak up, and maybe it's not about every issue. But, when we, kind of get the call to, hey, here's an issue that's happening. How do we talk about it? How do we write about it? Um, you know, who are we in conversation with? Are we always in this with the same kinds of groups of people, or always with people who look like us? Are there issues that come up either internally in an organization or externally where we see things are being done wrong, or there's being, racial injustice is committed? Do we say something about it?
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell stories to my students or in some of my presentations about looking back and saying, wow, this is something that happened that was racist and I didn't do anything about it. What should I have done? What would I do next time? And that's kind of a thing I share because sometimes, when I'm not facing racism every day, I don't, and it's not on my mind all the time. Something comes at me and I don't react fast. And sometimes a quick reaction is necessary. And so then I kind of play through that and talk about it and decide, okay, when I encounter this again, what am I going to do? Because I need to have a plan of action for things that I'm just, might not be quite ready for. Um, I'm not sure those are good measurables to
Mm-hmm.
answer your question. Um, but I think we have to be more aware of, the problems that are going on, and we need to find ways to address those issues. I mean, I'm certainly not great at it. And I want to say I try, but I don't try all the time. And I think we all need to do better.
Good, good. Mike, we're down to our last question. Usually the last question we throw out to our guests is, do you have any closing comments for our viewing or listening audience?
I mean, I think one of the things that has been really important for me around looking at racial justice is to really listen hard. I think sometimes when we start to get into conversations about what needs to be done, and we start to use terms like anti-racism or white fragility or white privilege, people start to kind of turn off and think, oh, that's not me. But I think if we listen to what particularly people of color are saying around racism, we can identify ourselves as in that, and things that we have done or we have seen done. And we just need to be able to listen to people's reactions, and how we can be better at what we do. And not to see, like, okay, we've done something that's prejudiced or been called out as racist, to listen to what is somebody saying about that. And if I've done something that I shouldn't have done, whether it's a racial issue or something else, I want to do better. And the only way that I can do better is to listen and to figure out how to act different. And so I think listening is really important. And then deciding to change how we behave, how we speak, how we advocate are all important pieces.
Good. Well, Mike, I really appreciate you being here, and I think it's a pleasure in terms of for many people to hear this for the first time that you've been engaged in this, and I'm enjoyed our conversation. Hopefully, we can probably do this again, but really appreciate you being with us today, and as we say, throwing down some heavy light and helping us to understand many of these important issues of our day. So, thank you very much.
It's always good to be with you, Ajmal. Thank you.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Throwing Down Some Heavy Light. Join us again next time. Barocco.